Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining on today's panel. My name is Aide Martinez. I'm a data lead here at Wizeline. First of all, I want to thank you all so much for dedicating this time and turning on for today's online panel called Future Now, Practical Applications of AI and How to Benefit Today. So here at Wizeline, we are focused on operationalizing AI. Sorry, I can't pronounce that word correct, but we're working on operationalizing AI on different ways. One of our goals, or our main goals as of the moment, is to be a referent in the AI market. So talking about me, let me tell you what I do here at Wizeline. My engineering position is as a data engineer. So if we talk on the process of in the 5-step of the data process, beginning with extraction, cleaning, processing, experiments, and graphic visualization, I deal with the first 2 steps, right? Extracting, cleaning, and things like that. But also we'll lead a lot of initiatives on driving Wizeline into an AI company. I'm a computer systems engineer, and I have a postgraduate in artificial intelligence that I studied in Japan. And other than that, I think we can move to the next slide, please. So first, we'll go over some quick housekeeping items. So this session is being run as a Zoom webinar, so you are able to focus on the discussion without any additional noise. The panelists will be asked a series of questions, and each of them will have 2 to 3 minutes to respond. Please, I encourage you to type your questions in the chat during the dedicated Q&A section, and we'll read your questions, right? The panel discussion is intended to last 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. So yeah. Let's go to welcome our panelists. Would you please introduce yourselves in the order you appear on the slide? Let's begin with Paul.
Yes, hi, I'm Paul Walborski. I was the co-founder of a company called AI Reverie, where we build a platform to generate synthetic data to train computer vision algorithms. Just as a general, so people understand what synthetic data is. These are images that are generated within a virtual world, or let's say a game environment, that are used to train a computer vision algorithm. So you annotate them there. It's nice to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Paul. Can you introduce yourself, David, please?
Yes, hi, thanks for having me, and it's nice to meet everybody. My name is David Sharbach, and I am the founder of the Toronto Machine Learning Society, as well as MLOps World, which is a community of about 15,000 machine learning practitioners, engineers, researchers, some folks from academia, as well as industry. And what we're really trying to do is understand the connections between folks working with models in production and exploring sort of how that fits into your typical engineering stack, as well as the product side as well. So yeah, that's my bio in a very quick nutshell.
Thanks, David. Can you introduce yourself? Alex, please.
Yeah, my name is Alejandro Rojas. I'm the VP of Applied Analytics at Parrot Analytics. What we do at Parrot is actually we help the leading media entertainment companies in making content decisions by actually capturing billions of activities from billions of consumers. When like they express their demand for like a TV show or a movie or a talent, we combine all of these like behavioral data so that based on models that we have, basically we can understand like if a show is going to be successful, and then if a platform is going to make more or less money by adapting their programming based on what consumers actually like.
Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you everyone for joining today, and thanks to our panelists. That's me. I already introduced myself. Thank you for willing to share your expertise and insights with us. So without further ado, let's dive into today's topic, right? So to start today's session, I would like to provide a few framing data points to get us acquainted with the current state of the AI landscape, right? So AI stands for artificial intelligence and refers to a set of technologies that, according to the Oxford Dictionary, are able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech recognition, decision-making, and translation between languages. Also, I like to describe artificial intelligence as the attempt to make a computer, an application, or a system smart or smarter than a human. AI is already around us, whether we realize it or not. For example, out of the 3,000 billion emails sent every day, machine learning detects at least half as a spam. More than 3 billion voice assistants are now in use, and 8 billion will be by 2023. 52% of telecommunications organizations utilize chatbots to increase their overall productivity. And all of us, we deal with smartphones and smart assistants in our places, in whatever we are. So we are like, AI is not the future, AI is the present. And according to IDC, the worldwide artificial intelligence market will grow from 327.5 billion in 2021 to 554.3 billion in 2024, registering a 5-year CAGR of 17.5%. So this is what we're dealing with, right? So as we can see, we're going to move right now to the question. So as we can see, AI is already playing a big role in our everyday lives, as I mentioned, in our smartphones, in every application we use, in every system we use, and the lives of our customers. So I'll start by asking the panelists, what are your favorite examples of AI technologies seeing real world use right now in 2022?
I think that's my cue. Yes, so I think one of the most interesting applications that I'm seeing right now is in cashier-less shopping. We've seen it with, for example, Amazon Go, and we actually did some work with 7-Eleven, right? So cashier-less shopping is this experience that you walk into a store, you can actually walk around, pick items, put them into your box, bag, put them back into the shelf, and then you walk out and then you get the bill. That whole process is a very complicated process, and there's a lot of computer vision that goes with that, right? So what we did with 7-Eleven is that we provided synthetic data for them to understand activity, so the activity of grabbing something from a shelf, and also the object detection, what they're grabbing. We right now, I think it's a nascent stage. Right now, these applications, cashier-less shopping works really well within a structured environment, let's say a predetermined store that you know where everything is at. But the promise that in the future, think about just putting a camera on any part of a store. You don't understand the structure of the store, but now you can actually understand the activity and the object detection. So I think that's one of the most interesting things that I've been seeing, and it's happening now, and it's just only going to get better.
Awesome. David, can you help us with your answer?
Yeah, happy to jump in. So it's a good question. There's so many different options and ways you could go with this based on what industry you're in, right? So as you mentioned, it's so integrated into products and services that we see. For me, TinyML is a fascinating subject, and federated learning as well. So this concept of using a machine learning technique that trains an algorithm across several decentralized edge devices is something that we see very frequently. So for example, in Google, if you have a Google or an Android phone and you're using Hey Google or Hey Siri, the Google Assistant uses federated learning. So I think as we mature into stages where companies are looking to protect the data, protect themselves against various malicious sort of intent that is out there, and you want to sort of hard case your systems and make sure that you're operating an environment where legally and in terms of compliance, you're in a good space. Methods like federated learning are really interesting for me, amongst others. But that's something that I've been really fascinated with just as of recent.
Thank you, David. It was great input. Alex, can you go next?
Yeah, so I mean, I think from what I'm seeing, more like in the media space, it's all about how like consumer behavior can be leveraged to understand if that consumer is going to subscribe to a service or is going to like a specific show. So one of the models that we have built, which we've been very successful at predicting success, is like actually understanding the star power of talent and then combining that with a specific topic that maybe a show is going to address, and combining these two elements based on like what we see from like the interest that consumers may have, both for the talent and both for the topic, and then understanding if that combination is going to be successful as a, for example, like a class or like a show, you know. So we've seen a lot of that, and that's more like on a granular level. But then if you think about more from a company level, we are able to actually do that. Basically, if you aggregate this, if you take a company like Netflix, for example, and you look at like the appeal that each of the titles that they have on their catalog is generating over time, we measure the demand for every specific show. And then when you track the demand for like the complete catalog, you can actually see that there's like a strong correlation to the number of subscribers that they attract. So those sort of data, I mean, all of this data is consumer behavior, but capturing this consumer behavior and then predicting that this is going to translate into subscriptions, I think is very valuable, because basically it gets you from a perspective of understanding signals and then directly to money. And I think that's really what businesses care about.
I love that. Yeah, I agree totally with both of your answers. I mean, it depends totally in which area are we talking about, or which segment are we talking about, if we're talking about industry, research, whatever. And it's nice that you mentioned data, Alex. Now, I have a specific question, but for both of you, Paul and David. Paul, I understand that your company, AI Reverie, provides an AI platform that generates synthetic data at scale to train computer vision algorithms. And David, I know you're the executive director of the Toronto Machine Learning Society. My question for you both is, how do you ensure that your training data used in your AI models and systems doesn't introduce bias? How we deal with this responsible AI subject? Paul, I don't know if you want to go first.
Oh, so sure. So yeah, so I just to understand bias for everybody who's listening. The problem that you have with computer vision, at least in computer vision algorithms, is that algorithms only understand what they see. And how we train them is that we use images that are annotated to train those algorithms, right? So you have to give them, for example, if you're trying to train a computer vision algorithm to understand cars, if you only provide the algorithm images of Toyota cars, every time that the algorithm tries to guess in the real world what's a car, every time it sees any car, it would think it's a Toyota car. So the issue is that you have issues of distribution, image distribution. So one of the things that synthetic data does really well is, because it comes from a virtual environment, we are able to create the right distribution of what cars are. So we can have a Mercedes, we can have a Tesla, and so on. I'm making it fairly simple. But the beauty of synthetic data is that you can try to remove that bias from the data set, have the real distribution that is in the world, and then train the algorithm against that. So one of the promises of synthetic data is to actually reduce bias in algorithms.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting approach, and I appreciate Paul mentioning some of those details. So for me, I'd actually take a step back and say, bias is something that we all hold, and just firstly acknowledging that, right? So there's going to be biases that we hold, both positive and negative biases, right? So sort of acknowledging that. And then the companies that I've seen that do this really successfully, they're incorporating everybody from their team, involving them in the products, involving them in the decision-making process. And I know I'm taking a step back just from the data, but in terms of modeling a solution or modeling a product, you really want to include different people from all diversity, backgrounds, standpoints, genders, as much to the extent that you can. So for example, in the engineering community, in the machine learning community here in Toronto, and I'm sure this exists in many places of the world, it's not unique to in Canada, but there's a bit of an issue where there's not that many females, for example, that are working on teams. And this is an issue because when you're building out a service or a product, it's very easily to apply your own internal biases to something, to not recognize that there's ways in which the data is flawed. It is going to be inherently flawed to some extent. You want to engineer that as best you can, but the way to do that is to include people from different vantage points, from different backgrounds. And again, it's not just your data engineers or your data scientists who can be working on this. You want to incorporate everybody that's working within the business as a top-down approach to help them model a product, to help them identify where there might be bias or where somebody's user experience might be flawed to the extent that you could be liable or you could be held accountable to a decision that a model's making that you may or may not be able to explain. So I think incorporating as many people as possible to sort of uncover potential biases that as a team, when you're modeling from a product standpoint or from a service standpoint, you can identify from the onset.
I love part of your answers. This is a subject that really gets me excited, the bias subject. And as you mentioned, Paul, bias in intelligent systems, it's almost the same as unconscious bias we have as persons, right? The way we live, the context in where we live is the way we see the world. And we cannot, and if we practice empathy, we can see the world through others' eyes. But it's the same with an intelligent system. Only the things you've seen, only the things you've experienced are the things that you're going to learn. And it's the same with humans. And I truly agree with you, David, having diversity, but just as you said, this is not only the job of data engineers and data scientists. This should be an interdisciplinary team with UI, UX, psychologists, I don't know, researchers on whatever, right? I think we tended to think in the past that this was only like data scientist job. We're the ones that did the predictions, but as the time has moved on, we've realized that we need everybody involved in order to make this an inclusive technology also. And thank you for your answers.
And just if I can quickly add, just adding to David, is in any organization when you're building algorithms, you have to have an audit function before you start releasing. You do need to go back to your data sets, understand what the data sets are comprised in, bring people from the whole team to really evaluate, because if not, you're going to be running fast, but you're going to be making lots of mistakes in that process. And I think that function of auditing data sets, it's not as rigorous as it should be.
Yeah, and I also think that we should work hand to hand with experts on the data we're working on, right? If we're working with healthcare data, if we're working with whatever data we are working with, we might be experts on AI, we might be experts on algorithms or models or whatever, but I think it's really important to work with experts on the data so we can decrease bias and make them perform better. I don't know if you agree with that. So, okay. My next question is for Alejandro, who is a VP of Applied Analytics at Parrot Analytics. I love that name. A company that is primarily focused on measuring consumer attention metrics, like the amount of time people spend paying attention to everything from short-form creative for ads to long-form content like TV shows. Alejandro, based on your experience, could you please weigh in on how AI is transforming the customer experience right now across not only media, but all industries?
Yeah, I mean, I think, let me start with media first, because it's an industry that I know better. And I think it's an industry that we interact every day, because like whenever we want to see a movie or we want to watch a show, we're basically interacting with content, and that's like very natural for consumers. And I think what we have seen over time, especially now, there's like almost like a limitless amount of shows or movies or like really entertainment options, right? It has grown dramatically. So when you think about it from the consumer perspective, that gives you like so many choices that it becomes like almost like overwhelming to understand what exactly what it would be the type of show that you would like, or what would be the type of movie that you want to see, and that's where I think AI can really help really consumers make decisions, because like based on what you have done in the past, then obviously you're going to belong to a specific taste cluster, and that taste cluster tend to have certain preferences. And like based on how we essentially like track all of this consumption of like different shows, because imagine like now, so that you guys have a reference, we track over, we track thousands of shows and thousands of movies, and then we can see what is the appeal that somebody who watches a movie like The Batman may have for like another movie like Spider-Man, for example, or like a show like Stranger Things. So understanding those connections between these different nodes and actually mapping that, it's almost like a big social network, if you want to think about it, because like a user may interact with different nodes, and then like by clustering this, then you start understanding that there's a specific people that would have a specific preferences, and then based on those preferences, then like we can build recommendation systems that really are going to guide you to really help you pick the type of shows or the type of like entertainment options that you like. And that makes your life easier, because at the end of the day, it's really like helping you decide what you like. And from the point of view of the company itself, it's just making the consumer experience seamless, because like the consumer doesn't have to kind of search for what they want to watch. It's almost like the company knows already like what are you likely to enjoy, And like if you take this analogy and like you move it to other industries, I think we're seeing that, in e-commerce and all these other industries. At the end of the day, is trying to understand, if there's something that you're gonna be resonating with, if there's like a specific product that you're gonna like, and trying to predict that. I think it's like you can do it based on consumer behavior. Obviously, it's not gonna be perfect. And I think if you talk to people would say, oh, like, I still think that the recommendation systems are not the best. But when you look back, I mean, I think it's been like a dramatic increase in terms of like how accurate they are in predicting what you would like. And I think that rate of change, I think, is what we have to kind of pay attention with, because at the end, it's like the more data we collect and the more like, these models, basically, the more they learn about you, the better they're going to be at predicting things that you like. And sometimes maybe the algorithm would maybe understand you better than you understand yourself, I think. So that's another point to kind of like keep in mind. But yeah, like multiple like uses based on that, trying to understand preferences based on how you behave.
I totally agree, Alejandro. Sometimes we believe us as humans are so unique, but we all belong to a cluster in every social media or company or whatever, where they target ads or they target information or content to us because we match on a certain profile. So yeah, we always think we're unique, but we belong to groups in each social media. Paul, I think you want to add something. I'm not sure.
I'm good with that.
Okay, but I have a question for you. You mentioned, I think it was the first question, this example for 7-Eleven, right? How do you think this changed the customer experience, this solution you were working on? How does this change the customer experience for customers in general?
I mean, I think the customer experience is, so what I think people don't like to do is wait on a line trying to pay. So when I go to the supermarket here, and after I go buy all the stuff that I want, I have to wait sometimes 10, 15 minutes on the line to be able to pay. So I think there's going to be a massive customer benefit, because time is money, or time is also the equivalent of leisure. That customers basically say, great, now I will stand in line less. The technology lowers the amount of friction on transactions, and this is what's happening. And I think also, companies or retailers are going to benefit, because, one is, the customer experience is better, but there's probably less man hours that go into delivering the same service, but at a lower cost in the future. So I do think there's a big benefit for cashier-less shopping or using AI in retail.
I totally agree. And I think that should be accompanied with some mindset change, because some of us are used to like normal shopping or normal stuff. So I think it also requires like a mindset from the customers, right? Anyways, shifting gears, I'd like to discuss the topic of AI's business benefits and return on investment for enterprises. Starting with Alejandro, could each of you provide your perspective and an example of how you've already seen AI improve business results and how you predict AI could drive future improvements?
Yeah, I mean, again, using the example from like the media industry, I think the thing about the media industry, when you think about it, is like you have to invest significant resources into producing a movie or producing a TV show, and you don't know if that show is going to resonate with audiences until you actually like release it, right? And you already spent the money. So from that perspective, any technology that allows you to have a better sense of how successful this investment is going to be, basically is going to be reflected on better ROI. And what we have seen, especially now, as we get more data on consumer behavior, all of this, as I was saying before, like all of this data in consumer behavior, we can translate into the propensity for these consumers to actually subscribe to a service. And once you have that relationship between behavior and propensity to subscribe, you establish a connection between like consumer behavior and amount of revenue that you can generate. And with that, essentially, you can start valuing opportunities because like based on a specific TV show or a specific movie, you can start predicting how successful that movie is going to be in terms of attracting a specific audience. And then like based on those predictions, then you can assess, what is the value that that's going to generate for your company. And if you assess correctly, what is the value that movie or that show is going to generate, then how much investment it would require to really generate the return that you're looking for. So this is, to me, it's almost like if you really want to generate returns and the expected returns that the market is expecting on like a lot of these like streaming services, for example, you have to have like a really deep understanding of how are you investing your capital and how many subscribers are you getting almost for every new show or every new movie that you're producing, and data and behavioral data can certainly help you doing that, and also understanding the complete ecosystem, because at the end of the day, what you have to remember is like we live in an attention economy where like you're not in isolation. So you have to think about like, okay, what is the competition doing? Like what's going to be released this weekend so that you know how you're going to program this, because like attention we only have 24 hours a day. Each of us, that's limited. And you have to think about like, how do I kind of like cut through the clutter so that we're able to kind of get people's attention and then convert that attention into dollars.
Great, thank you, Alejandro. Paul, could you give us your insight on this question?
Yeah, so there's a couple of areas that I think there's really interesting ROI that I've seen. The first one is on, if you think about it like food production in a sense, one of the biggest challenges that you have in agriculture is the amount of pesticide that we actually use on our crops. So there's been a lot of work from some large companies trying to create computer vision applications that can detect weeds and can differentiate between the weed and the crop. And the important part of that is that if you are able to do that correctly and with high degree of certainty, instead of putting pesticide in all the crops, you only put pesticide perhaps on the weeds. So that has a massive impact on what we consume and our health, and that ROI is fairly large globally. But as a business, also as a business, you always want to bring the best product to the consumer, so that helps. But it also reduces the amount of pesticide that you use, which is a cost input into the production, right? So I think that's a really interesting place. I've seen other areas, and we haven't worked directly in that. We had conversations, but if you think about oncology, right, cancer detection, right now we sort of try to detect cancer with different stages of cancer. But imagine there's a lot of information out there about images of how things evolved and how your cells look and so on and so forth. If you can start detecting not only by specific times, but a continuous of how you're seeing cells deteriorate, you might be able to help not in the prevention, but in how do you deal with cancer. We haven't worked directly with that, but there's been a lot of talk around that. And I think that's really interesting where the ROI is. So, AI has this benefit of not only it's a cost benefit. Yeah, now you can do things more effectively, efficiently, but it also has things that we can actually deliver greater value to people, right? Because you can like advance different movement causes and solutions.
Great, I totally agree. David, would you mind giving us your insight?
Sure. So one thing that I think has really swept through the machine learning, deep learning community over the past 1-2 years is in natural language processing, transformer models like GPT-3 came out. We're seeing an unprecedented ability for algorithms to simulate human beings through speech and text, to the extent where regulation and compliance can't keep up. And they can summarize, a sporting game, an article, and a blog, and put together something that's really convincing, right? And we're starting to see this branch out into different languages, not just English. I mean, it's been predominantly English in the research and the bulk of the data that it's been used and trained on. But we're seeing this branch out into different industries. Now, the implications of this are massive. So if you're using a typical chatbot and you have any question that kind of goes outside of the templated response that the chatbot is used to responding to, now all of a sudden you're going to be able to have a conversation with an algorithm, with a machine learning model that basically you won't be able to decipher from a real human being, right? To the extent that I'm not suggesting that we'll pass the Turing test right off the bat, but for the method and the purpose that it's intended to, say, for example, the retail use case. So I think that's very interesting. Now, the second thing and the way in which I see this going is any city you're in, any fairly large company that's even relatively forward thinking is probably looking to hire an engineer, a software developer with an understanding of data science and machine learning. Machine learning engineers are a massive demand in search, and that's because the successes that we've seen from Google, from Facebook, from Amazon, from Netflix, you got to remember these are AI companies first, so they're products that are based around AI. Whereas your typical company is going to be non-traditional tech company, right? Your retail companies, for example. Now, what does that mean? It means that they're dealing with legacy technology. It means that they're dealing with people that aren't trained as classical researchers or data scientists. So there's a void in terms of the understanding principles and methodologies of the engineering and software engineering practices that support the models in a production environment. And that's really important. Proof of concepts are amazing. There's lots of dev shops that will give you an amazing proof of concept and even show you great responses, great results, great prediction rates on your models, no matter what industry almost at this point. How you incorporate that into your existing software system in terms of your existing business structure is a question that's very difficult to answer. The data is going to be different based on industry, your team size, your team's training level, the industry itself, the regulations, the budget that you have, the time that you have, the amount in which the models need to be retrained. All of these things are very complex systems, and every company is going to be facing these in a different way. So for me, the really interesting part at the moment is, we have years now of DevOps practices and methodologies that are tried and tested and shared. We don't have a lot of MLOps best practices. It's still very new. It's still very nascent. So how do companies create models and sustain them in live environments and continuously uptrain their model or detect when a model is becoming inaccurate, right? Very complex, very, very new, very young, very nascent in the industry. So there's a ton of people exploring this. And I could go on for a long time, but for the sake of this, I won't belabor the point, but I think that this is really an interesting opportunity for small to mid-sized companies to incorporate machine learning responsibly, ethically, and in a way that's cost effective. Because we can't all model the Google way, which is spend millions and millions of dollars on tech talent. That's the reality, is that people don't have the time. It's hard to get stakeholders to buy in for that amount of time. And in a lot of cases, there's either an over people overestimate the amount of that machine learning and AI can do within your company, or they grossly underestimate it. So finding that middle ground is very tricky, and that's something that as a community, everybody's still trying to sort of feel themselves around and determine what best practices actually look like.
If I could just add quickly to that, because I think it's a great point. One of the things that we found is that there's this thing called like the fallacy of a successful first initiative. And what that means is that, right now there's enough tools out there and data that you can actually train an algorithm and get like a 70% performance rate. And people say, oh my God, that was so easy. I just did it and that was easy. So clearly I can like build it out and send it to the wild. But getting things, if they become mission critical, or you need to make sure that these things work in the wild at very high rates, taking algorithms to perform from a 70% to like 90%, and then from 90% to 95% involves lots of work, lots of data, lots of iteration. So we also have to be just careful as we use and implement AI, that we just don't say, oh yeah, this was easy, like I can do it fairly easily. To get things to mission critical does involve a lot of work, a lot of investment, and and making sure that you're following the right path. So that just adds to David's point that there's still a lot of work there within our group of people training.
Paul, and I think you bring like a very interesting point, because like in certain industries, like for certain tasks, like a 70% accuracy is like good enough for what they're trying to accomplish. So like it's all about understanding like what is that threshold, and like what is the amount of resources that you need so that you create a solution that is also viable from a business perspective. So yeah, it's always like you have to kind of like understand how critical is that mission, and like what is the rate of accuracy that you must have, so that you have a sense of like, as you said, like, to get to 70, it's like, it's going to be easier than like that jump from 70 to 90 is going to be a lot harder, and like from 90 to 99 even harder, right? So, and that correlates to the amount of resources that you have to kind of invest. So you have to see if it makes sense to kind of like go that route, depending on what you're trying to solve.
I totally agree on all of your answers, and I'm going to bring my 2 cents on this, because you've all mentioned super interesting points. So I totally agree on the fact that it depends on on the problem you're solving and the objective of your model, the precision that you are going to deal with. But I certainly think that if there's human rights involved, it should be like focused on get almost 99.9%, right? If there's anything related to human lives or anything that dangerous, you should point to the top performance, right? Other than that, yeah, you can point to bigger performances or bigger precision, but I think when it's related to human lives, we should point to the biggest, right? And also, what you were saying, David, that there's not like it depends on your budget, depends on your needs, depends on your structure, the way you're gonna implement AI. I truly agree on that. There's no like magic sauces on this area. I think it's like medicine, there's different sickness and there's different medicines for each sickness. And here it's different cases, different areas, different scenarios, different budgets. So I get this question a lot about what's the best amount of data, what's the best amount of invest, or what's the best tool. And I think the answer is always, it depends on the problem you're trying to solve and what your objective is, right? And finally, the last thing I want to add, it's I think in the past, like data scientists belong for a long time to research and development areas, right? So now we're bringing them and we're creating this data engineer and machine learning ops to the production environment and to automating models and all those things. So I think we're still in that transfer period where we are dealing with new skills that are needed. I totally agree on that. We need a lot of much more best practices of ML ops. We're still like writing the definition of what ML ops do or means, right? So yeah, I appreciate those answers. And finally, I want to close our panel by getting our panelists expert advice on how to be successful with AI. And this is a very open question, but I'm going to narrow it a little bit. Whether it's early stages or a more mature AI technology implementation, what's a good place to get started as a company with AI? Then what are the key principles to keep in mind for long-term success? And just pointing out, I know there's no magic sauce, but what are your insights? David, would you mind going first?
Sure. So I would say for a company that's starting out, try and get some small wins, right? You don't have to go for the gusto right away. You can start with some small incremental benefits so that you get buy-in across the organization, most importantly from the stakeholders who are funding those projects. Some things that you might want to ask right off the bat: what current processes are you using within your workflow, right? What tools are you using? What is done manually? What's automated at the moment? What problem are you trying to solve, right? That's a big one. Are you trying to track something, predict something, report? And then also understanding your data is really important. So where does it come from? Is it clean? Did it go through a data engineering pipeline already? Is it, you know, what kind of condition do you need that data to be in so that it's sustainable and then it lives within your production system continuously? Because it's one thing to have, you know, we have a lot of engineering blogs that talk about day one, and not very many that talk about day two when the model breaks. You know, COVID happens, supply chains break down, all of these other factors come in. What happens to your model, especially when some of these companies have thousands of models? I speak with companies that have a model for each customer that they have, right? These are hundreds of thousands of models in production at the same time. So when they have model drift, what does that look like? So just starting off small with some incremental wins. As you know, everybody said previous, which was a great point. You don't have to go for the highest percentage point. There's a bias that deep learning folks will have, or data science will have, that's almost like, this is a cool approach, let's do it. In some cases, it's not even a machine learning model that needs to be in production. It's not even a data science problem, right? You could get by with some other things oftentimes. Other times, maybe you want to start really conservative. So when I speak with people in the financial industry, they say, yeah, listen, we have some of the top researchers, but computational costs for a deep learning model are astronomical. And when compliance rolls around, when we're, say, giving out loans and they ask for an explanation of why our model made a certain decision, if we can't answer that, we might be in really hot water. So we will use random forests, right? Because it's costly, it's explainable. And when you're talking about these computational requirements and the engineering requirements, specifically when it's on these old legacy systems, this is just what makes sense for us, right? So that's a lot. I'll stop it there, but I would say, in short, just small incremental wins and really understanding and getting your processes correct, because otherwise you're going to go too fast too soon, and then you'll have to go right back and redo a lot of the work, and it's going to cost a lot. And then if you're working with a client or you're working with stakeholders at a company, they might take that for an inability or an example of how machine learning doesn't work, and that's actually just a wrong application, a wrong starting point. It's not that it can't work. It's just that you created it and you sort of went from this first foot wasn't strong. So you need to take it from the first approach in small incremental wins.
Great, David. Thank you. What is your advice, Alejandro?
I mean, I think I agree with what David was saying. I mean, I would add the following: like, you should always start with having like some sort of mental model or like some sort of hypothesis that you want to solve for. So for example, in our case, we were always thinking about like, oh, if we were to quantify the attention economy, like, what do we need to do this? So then like we are, okay, so this is what we're trying to solve. Then like we can kind of start thinking from a perspective of supply and understand that, oh, by supply, we mean like there's like shows, there's like movies, there's like all of this stuff. Let's just map that and let's see where that's like sitting, and let's start kind of like almost like mapping this. And then on the demand side, it's all about looking at the consumer, right? Like all of these signals, I would tell you, this is a show that is popular. This is a show that's going to drive subscriptions. And once you have this in place, you have like the building blocks, right? So you should have those building blocks and then test the hypothesis that you initially had, right? Because it may be that, you have to validate this. Like all of these models don't live like, in a vacuum. You have to kind of test it with like, what's the actual, what's actually happening in the market. And that's sort of what we do, like when we're looking at, oh, is this kind of like our thesis of the attention economy? being validated with what we see with the amount of the number of subscribers that all of these platforms are getting based on the demand that they're having for their content. So all of that I think is important. And once you have that in place, then like you can start like really trying to like fine tune things and really understand like, okay, what are the nuances that you need to understand to really solve specific things. You start like, you know, really addressing problems that you may have. And at a certain point, it's also useful to kind of think about like a little bit out of the box in terms of like, because a lot of times companies tend to just analyze their own data. And sometimes it's useful to kind of look at like external data that may be outside of your current environment, because that would allow you to also answer other questions that you know, you may not be able to answer because the data that you may have may be a little bit biased based on like the consumers that you have. So I think it's like, if you think from that perspective, starting with a mental model, then like validating, like kind of building it, validating that model, and then thinking about other ways to improve this is kind of like a good kind of framework to follow. And with that, I think that can apply. You have to obviously start with specific questions that you're trying to solve. Because like as my friend, like the head of data science for CIA, my friend Andre Vargas used to say that we want to control the data and not the data control us. And I like that quote because that summarizes really, you know, a lot of times people get too embedded into like the sexiness of like a machine learning model. But at the end of the day, it's like, you know, we have to go back and see, okay, what is it that we're trying to solve? What is it the question that we're trying to answer? And we have to be able to articulate that and then like try to tackle that in the most effective way.
I totally agree, Alejandro. Thank you for your input. Paul, let's pause with you.
Yeah, no, I think the panel has really, you know, shined the light on exactly what should be done. I mean, just to reinforce a little bit, I think AI is basically a product development process, and we need to apply best practices as we do in product development. So I would basically, you know, make sure that whenever you start that, you start thinking about like almost like a user design experience and what are we trying to do? What is the goals about this? What is the ultimate goal? And, you know, like David said, you know, do what I call, you know, a friend of mine who's a product development person, he or she actually said, it's like building a cake. You don't go out and build a cake. You first build little cupcakes. And when you learn how to build little cupcakes, then you go build a bigger cake and a bigger cake. And I do think that you have to go through that. So then in that process, you have a goal, you know where you're going, what you're trying to prove, what are the constraints that you need. And then you have quick wins, right? You go in and you start proving out your assumptions, making sure that it works and see where it's not going to work. And then have the bigger business question. Okay, if this works, how do we deploy? What's the cost of deployment? What happens, like David said, when you have drift, what happens at? How do we adjust for that? But my view is that's the process that you need to take. So it's somewhat of a structured process. Think about it's just product development, and we're just applying product development. And the last thing I would say, and this is a little bit, and I'm going back to data, right? Because I'm a hammer and I think everything's a nail. But I think having the right data lake is super important. So you need to do an audit of the data that you have internally. How good of a data is it? Do you own it, or can you use it? You have to annotate it correctly. Make sure that your ontology is correct, so you can actually train your algorithms correctly. And make sure that you have the data and see where you have holes in that data lake and try to plug those holes. And going back and understand, okay, will that data lake provide bias? And if there's going to be bias in that data lake, how do you deal with that bias? So before you do anything that or should be in parallel as you're developing your product, make sure that you're building out that data lake. That's key to this process.
Perfect. Thank you. Great way of closing. So we're gonna move to the Q&A section. So while we process the questions that came in during the discussion, I'd like to take a moment to tell you a bit more about what we're doing with AI at Wizeline. So our practice itself, it's formed by over 150 data and AI experts coming from data engineers, data scientists, data analysts, and principal engineers and things like that. We have 24 plus customers where we work on anything related with data, AI, and machine learning. Our roles, as I mentioned already, are data engineers, data analysts, data scientists, and ML ops engineer. So this is like the entire data lifecycle split in several steps, which is like to define, ingest, analyze, repair, clean, prepare, augment, explore, compare, predict, prescribe, model, validate, refine, deploy, and observe. So this is, I mentioned before, like the 5 steps of data, which are the generals, but these are like smaller steps, and we tackle all of these. Our services, or what we provide, is obviously AI and machine learning, advanced analytics, big data engineering, data management platforms, data lakes and data warehouses construction, robotic process automation, and we also provide like a specific workshops if you have like no clear idea on your data goals and you're just like arriving on the AI area, on the AI train. We can work with you on a workshop to help you define your key objectives around data, right? So now let's do our Q&A. It looks like we have 3 questions from our audience. So let's begin with the first one. This one is from Fernando Gomez. It says, what about AI in education? Do you consider if colleges, whether private or public colleges, are investing enough resources, not only to use AI as part of their processes, but to prepare their professors and students in these topics? Who would like to answer this one?
I think, oh, go ahead, Alejandro.
No, go ahead, Paul. Go ahead.
No, so from my views, I think that we're under-investing tremendously in AI and STEM and everything else. I think that there has to be a shift of focus. And I think we need to be investing in education at sort of the middle school level and up. I also think that and this is my own personal view, I think that we need to think about AI and STEM and all this as a vocational education too, that, you know, we need to sort of prepare with the right tools for people not only to be the computer scientists, but people supporting computer scientists and ML ops and so on. So I do think that there's an underinvestment, and this is globally, right? Although I actually do think that China is doing some massive investments in education. And vocational education, data scientists, so that's something to watch. But I don't think we're doing enough, at least in what I know in the US and also in maybe Mexico.
Yeah, one thing to point out is like there are organizations that are actually working on like tackling that issue. For example, I know of one that is called Data Science for Everyone. And this is a group that was created by like University of Chicago professors. And what they do is like they try to collect like, I mean, it's more like on the data science part of things, but like they try to collect like best practices of like, you know, how they teach this to kids in high schools. I've been I also had experience of like teaching kids in high school certain things in terms of how to apply some of these like data science concepts, especially like, you know, when you think about like the basis of data science, you're thinking about statistics. And that's something that usually like the high school curriculum lacks, and it's such a critical component of everything that is going to be built on top of that. And I think there's like a lot of ways that you can start doing this. Some of the things I've been involved in is in creating simulations so that people kind of like think about how to use data science from a perspective of like really simulating certain things. In the case that I've been involved, it's related to media because these are simulations where like kids actually create their own streaming service and they make decisions based on the data that they receive, and it becomes like an educational experience, but also it's a great introduction to like some of these concepts. And I think there's like a huge opportunity there. We need more people who are capable on AI, and I think we need to train them like as early as possible. We don't have to wait till they go to the college to start really hammering out these concepts, and that's really personally what I think.
Can I just
Totally
add
agree.
two really quick things there? I think there's a really large opportunity for the field of education to advance and accommodate more students that are not neurotypical. So using AI to explore different ways to connect with non-neurotypical students is one thing. And the second thing is there's a huge missed opportunity right now within the education. It's not serving young women to the extent that it can. So for example, there's lots of research that shows that young women in preschool, school, high school even, have a lot of the core competencies that would lend themselves to data science and machine learning. But at a disproportionate rate, they tend to fall into categories of, say, if it's sciences, nursing, for example, or healthcare that's not even the strong analytics, but more the nurturing sort of fields that have traditionally been thought of as more female-oriented careers. What that means is that the highest potential data scientists of the future are being currently channeled into non-data science related work, which means as an industry or as a community, you're not getting the top talent, right? So I think we could do a better job of encouraging more diversity in the fields of AI.
Totally agree. Neurodiversity should be a huge focus nowadays. And for the last question, well, today's session was about the current AI landscape and its readiness for real-world use. I'm wondering about some far-off AI prediction. What's the most futuristic thing you foresee happening with AI? Help us answering each one of you, but with just one example, the most futuristic you can think of.
How about sentient beings?
That is futuristic.
That will replace humans.
Oh.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess it would maybe be some type of mix between live machine learning entertainment, which I'm seeing more of, so creative AI,
Wow.
mixed with what we're seeing with the metaverse, so some type of virtual experience. That's as far as my brain can go.
Agree.
Yeah, one thing that for me is interesting is how like the potential of using AI for like more like artistic purposes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which you've seen like some of the elements, right? Like people who create, I mean, you have algorithms that basically create paintings and all that. I think that we're just seeing like the tip of the iceberg in that, and I'll be curious how that looks like 10 years from now.
Perfect. Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank our panelists again for their time. David, Alejandro, Paul, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed and I feel so honored to be hosting this panel. This was great. I love your insights. And for everyone on the webinar, let me tell you that we'll send you the recording and slides later today. And thank you all. Thank you for your time. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and hope it gave us a little bit more of the landscape of AI and the present of AI. Thank you guys, and have a great rest of your Thursday.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for everyone. Thanks.